New View with Gavin, James and Colin. We're back today and I want to begin with a brief announcement for our regular viewers and listeners to the programme. Our friend and co-host Gavin will be taking some time away from the show. You won't be seeing him on much of the episodes in this second season on YouTube, a third season overall, including our SoundCloud episodes. Gavin will be taking some time away on personal grounds. We, James and I, recognize that sometimes issues in your personal life are extremely important to take care of. Sometimes everybody needs a break to deal with issues that come up in life. And James and I respect that, and we wish Gavin the very best in dealing with the matters that he has to deal with. We respect his decision to do this little break that he needs right now, and we're wishing him all the best. We talk to him on a daily basis, and we're hoping that we'll be seeing him back on your screens and on the show real soon. Joining us today on the program is Jim Power. Jim is a Waterford native, an economist, an expert in economics actually. He was the Chief Economist at Friends First and Bank of Ireland, and today is an independent economist. In this episode, we talk about so many important issues in people's lives right now. We talk about the impact of COVID-19 coronavirus on the Irish economy, how this affects the jobs market. We also discuss the future of work. We talk about the gig economy, changes in the economy, AI, big tech, really important issues for listeners and viewers at home, and how we ensure a just transition in this economy, in this globalization. Jim and I have a very enlightening conversation about several other matters, including the possibility of a universal basic income. The closest thing that we saw to that type of measure in Ireland was the COVID unemployment payment. And it was very interesting to get Jim's take as an economist about universal basic income and its future and possibilities. I really hope that you at home gain real insight from this episode. It was a real honor to have somebody as well known and acclaimed in economics as Jim on the program. And of course, to let you know at home that Jim, in fact, is the author of a book which I believe has a very important title at times like these, even if it was written in the bust period, the post-Celtic Tiger period. And the title of that book is Picking Up the Pieces, Economic Crisis and Hope in Ireland. And so for many of us at home today, many will be wondering about how we pick up the pieces, how we rebuild in this post-COVID lockdown era. How do we find hope? And so for that, I turn now to my interview with Jim Power. Today on the program, we're fortunate to have Jim Power. Jim and I met several years ago. I don't even know if he remembers, but in a guest lecture he gave for Robert Kenny in economics. I don't know if you remember
yes.
that, Jim. Do you?
In Tramore, I do indeed. Absolutely. A fair play.
It's good to see you again in very different circumstances anyway.
In very different circumstances, absolutely.
So, Jim, over a decade ago, you wrote the book Picking Up the Pieces, Economic Crisis and Hope in Ireland. Many families right now might be feeling that they are in a situation of crisis, their wages are cut or they're out of work, and people are feeling like they may have no hope. So the question for you, Jim, to start off with is, now that we are in stage 3 of NEFIT's plan, what is the economic outlook for families and young people out there who may be listening into the program today?
Okay, I think just to take us back a little bit, in 2019 was a challenging year for the world economy. We saw the US-Chinese trade war escalate. We saw a sharp slowdown in growth in the States, in China, and particularly in the Euro area. So coming into 2020, The international backdrop was challenging, okay, but there was cause for optimism at that stage because it was likely that Britain would avoid a hard Brexit on the 31st of January, which it did. It was likely that Trump and the Chinese would start to become more conciliatory and that the trade dispute would dissipate. And that's exactly what happened in the first couple of months of the year because Trump, being a pragmatic politician, if nothing else, the one thing he did not want in the run-up to the November election was a significant economic slowdown caused by a trade dispute with China. So I was more optimistic for the world economy in 2020, and as a consequence, I was pretty optimistic for Ireland's prospects as well. And of course, when in early March, the United Nations and the World Health Organization declared it a global pandemic, suddenly, all hell broke loose. But the world fundamentally changed. And what we've seen since then was an effective shutting down of large swathes of the world economy. And this is pretty much without precedent, at least in the last century. It's without precedent because normally during a recession, demand falls off, but businesses continue operating insofar as they can. But this time around, many businesses were forced to shut down. The global economic impact was dramatic. The International Monetary Fund has warned that this year could see the sharpest global slowdown since the 1920s. The OECD in more recent weeks, has warned about just how uncertain the whole outlook is globally at this stage. So the global backdrop, very, very challenging. And for the small, open Irish economy, obviously, we are at the cutting edge of all of those developments. And so we've seen since the middle of March, a dramatic decline in economic activity as large parts of the economy were shut down. Over the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've seen, we've progressed through the reopening phases and we've seen parts of the economy reopen. So economic activity is coming back. The number of workers receiving unemployment assistance is gradually falling. So things are at this juncture getting somewhat better. But I would not get carried away about that. It'd be naive to believe, we're going to return to normality anytime soon. There's no doubt about it. Globally and domestically, the next 12, 18 months will be incredibly challenging because obviously until a vaccine, a safe and effective vaccine is actually delivered, the risk of secondary outbreaks will be very real. And we're already starting to see some of that happening around the world. And I think secondly, many businesses that reopened will find trading conditions extremely difficult for the foreseeable future because of a variety of reasons. Consumer demand will be weaker. There's no doubt about that. There's a lot more uncertainty out there. But I think more particularly the whole social distancing protocols, the health protocols that have to be put in place will limit business volumes. So a challenging environment definitely over the next 12, 18 months. I haven't quite answered your question yet. I've gone around the houses, but
there's a lot to pick up on there, enough in what you've just said.
So can I just make one further point, I suppose, in addressing an issue that you specifically referred to, the outlook for young people and, certain categories of worker. Globally and domestically, I think there's no doubt about it, we are going to see a significant increase in inequality as a result of this, because many of the workers globally and domestically that have been worst affected by this crisis are younger workers, they're lower paid workers, many in service sector activities, particularly, the whole hospitality sector and the non-grocery retail sector. So I think for certain segments of our youth and our working population, the outlook is very, very challenging. On the other hand, there is a segment of the economy that has done very well over the last 4 or 5 months. If you work in financial services, the IT industry, indeed, if you're involved in the whole multinational sector in this country, your earnings have been maintained throughout the crisis. And in fact, in some cases, things have actually improved. And on the other side of the coin, the ability to spend that money has been seriously limited. So savings are building up as a consequence of that. So in a nutshell, the outlook for parts of the economy is reasonably positive. For other parts, it's incredibly challenging.
Mm-hmm. So you've hit a couple of nails on the head there, which feed into a broader idea, which is that the entire economy itself is transitioning on a global level. That some of the conventional forms of work and some of the conventional industries are starting to go on a downturn, and some new areas such as tech, for example, or AI are starting to rise. So just touching on something there, how do we ensure that this transition in the economy globally is a just one? Because I'll give you one example, Jim, that I can think of. I have a friend who's doing gig economy work, and this form of work is just cycling around delivering pizzas, takeaway, this kind of thing. And his conditions of work are pretty shaky, I would say at best. So how do we tie in ensuring that the economic growth, that there is economic growth, but that the economic growth is itself fairer for people?
Okay, there's a lot there. In terms of the transition that's taking place, there are many important segments of the Irish economy. Agri-food is very important. The outlook there is reasonably positive. The whole multinational sector here, and notwithstanding challenges from the corporate tax, international corporate tax developments from that side, that part of the economy is very, very robust. Over 245,000 people working in that sector directly. We can even see in the first 5 months of this year, chemical and pharmaceutical exports, which accounted for almost 66% of our total merchandise exports in the first 6 months of the year, 5 months, sorry, are growing at a rate of about 11.5%. So that part of the economy is strong. We have the whole sort of professional service side of the economy, including social media, some of it domestic, much of it multinational is still very strong. But the international tourism piece, that is really
it's in trouble.
It's the Achilles heel of Ireland at the moment, because last year we had 10.8 million overseas visitors into the country, almost 300,000 people employed in that broader tourism industry. You'd have to be very, very pessimistic about the outlook for that sector until a vaccine is delivered safely and effectively. So and as I said, I think all of these things just exacerbate a trend that was growing domestically and globally in recent years, which was the growth of inequality. You mentioned the growth of the gig economy. I am part of the gig economy, but I think I'm at the better end of the gig economy. You describe your friend who is at a much more challenging end of the gig economy. But if you're in the gig economy, your whole basis of security, pensions, holidays, entitlements are virtually non-existent. And that then becomes really exposed when you get the sort of crisis that we are getting at the moment. So I believe that there is an international and a domestic imperative to tackle these issues in a meaningful way. I mean, the social contract between employers and employees has broken down in recent years in many cases. Europe is better than the United States, and Ireland is somewhere in the middle. Okay, but it's a serious issue. So I think we're going to have to take another look at that social contract. I am doing some work at the moment looking at prospects for universal basic income, for example.
I have a question for you on that in a moment.
Yeah, I believe that is something that is going to have to be explored because, okay, inequality has many, many negative outcomes. One is obviously for the people themselves, poverty, the impact on their health, their quality of life, their mental well-being, etc., is pretty dramatic and disastrous. But there's also an economic effect. If you have large swathes of our economies living in dire poverty, obviously they cannot contribute to the economy in any meaningful way. And I think what flows out of all of that, and this really, in my view, is the kernel, What flows out of all of that is the rise of extremist politics.
Right.
You know, if you look at Trump, if you look at Brexit, if you look at the rise of Orban in Hungary, Poland, you know, the rise of the right, the rise of extremist politics around the world is becoming a very, very serious issue. And I think that definitely inequality is a big driver of that. So I think it's up to all of us now who want to live in a civilized society, a liberal society, etc. It's up to all of us now to push that agenda to address inequality in a meaningful way.
Well, let's look at Trump then, for example. You mentioned very briefly his protectionist economic policies against China in 2019, which caused these economic challenges. He has threatened that due to the COVID-19 outbreak, which he calls the China virus, that he will implement economic sanctions in the future. That's a very clear threat. So if he's re-elected later this year, we're very unsure if that'll be the case or not. But do you believe that that type of protectionism is very dangerous for a country like Ireland?
Yes, it is. I mean, in the last 3 or 4 decades, the driver of economic activity and social activity has been globalization. In fact, today in 1952, the European Coal and Steel Agreement was agreed. And that was the precursor for the Treaty of Rome in 1958 and the foundation of the European Union. So since then, in this part of the world, you know, free trade, globalization has been the big driver. And, you know, there have been downsides because it hasn't, in many cases, it hasn't been managed well. Okay, definitely it has exacerbated inequality.
Exactly, the inequality you mentioned.
Exactly, but I still think that just because there are negative side effects from something, it doesn't mean you should throw that something out. You need to address those problems. So I think globalization is fundamentally good and positive. You know, it has lifted a lot of people and a lot of countries out of poverty, particularly Africa, in recent years. And I do believe it is really the only option going forward. And okay, obviously not unfettered. You know, you've got to get in there and make sure that the losers in the whole process are supported to the greatest extent possible. And a universal basic income could be part of that. But the alternative would be the growth of protectionism, the growth of nationalism, which would be bad for global economic activity. It would be bad for individual countries. And I suppose for Ireland, more than any other country, we are the textbook example of small open economy. International trade in goods and services, the flow of people in and out of the country, they are a fundamental part of our economic model. So the growth of protectionism certainly would not suit Ireland. And, you know, we would be more exposed than most. And I think luckily it has its flaws, but I do think being part of the European Union does provide a certain level of insulation for us. But the thing that I think worries me about Trump is, you know, he's in trouble in the opinion polls at the moment. He still has until November to turn that around. And you'd just be really worried about what he might do over the coming months to try and turn that situation around. We're seeing him upping the ante against China again in recent weeks. But I think more sinisterly, he has started to cast his beady eyes on the European Union. And he argued in a speech at the beginning of last week, for example, that the European Union was a construct put in place to undermine the United States. That is a total misunderstanding and misrepresentation of history. I mean, the basis of the European Union was to create a much greater level of economic, social, and political integration in Europe with one objective, that is to prevent another war on the continent, you know, following 2 devastating world wars fought in Europe. So, but that's Trump at the moment. You know, this is the rhetoric, and unfortunately he's following up some of that rhetoric with action. So
Hmm.
in answering your question in a nutshell, the growth of nationalism and protectionism, economically and socially, in my view, would not be good news for Ireland.
Hmm. Now, putting on your Economist's app for a moment, when you look at this lockdown policy that was applied almost universally across the board, do you think that the lockdown, as you said, these were unprecedented times, do you think that the lockdown was a necessary step, or do you believe that perhaps in drafting the policy that there should have been some economists in the room helping to balance it so that it's not just from a health perspective?
To be honest, I am loath to criticise any country or any
Hmm.
policy-making body over their approach to this, because we were pretty much in an unprecedented situation. And I'll address your question in a second, but I think first it's instructive to go back and look at what happened over a century ago with the outbreak of the Spanish flu in 1918. The Spanish flu hit in the spring of that year. It was mainly in the United States, but then obviously spread to Europe and had devastating consequences. But by the end of the summer of that year, the Spanish flu was brought under control. And then from October onwards, it re-escalated in dramatic fashion and actually killed a hell of a lot more people over the coming months than it did during the initial outbreak of it. And research conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis shows that the states, and back then, the Federalist United States system enabled different states to respond differently to that epidemic. And it showed that those countries that shut down most aggressively, they obviously suffered more economic damage during the shutdown, but over the next couple of years, they recovered much more quickly than those states that didn't. So there is a bit of precedent here for lockdown being the most effective way. And I think that, if you put yourself in the shoes of policymakers, there's a very difficult balancing act at the moment. One is to try and protect and preserve the health of the nation. And the second is to try and protect and preserve the health of the economy. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to achieve a good balance between the two. There's no doubt about it. We had a pretty aggressive lockdown in this country, caused massive economic pain for a while. But in terms of keeping the epidemic under control, it was effective. But definitely there comes a point where you cannot keep economies locked down forever. And because, without economic growth, the economic and social and political consequences of that would be absolutely devastating. So it's essential that we start to reopen the economy in as safe a way as possible. And until a vaccine is actually developed, it is going to be an incredibly difficult balancing act. And, we're seeing that playing out all over the place at the moment. As economies are opening up, we're getting fresh outbreaks, and we're starting to see closures of parts of economies again. And unfortunately, that's going to be the way of it for the next 12, 18 months. But I also think that we're placing way too much emphasis and burden on the shoulders of policymakers to solve this problem. I mean, it's up to individual behavior. We've all got to behave in an appropriate way. And unfortunately, many people simply do not. So, if you could convince everybody to, satisfy all of the protocols that are proven to work, like face coverings, like hand sanitization, social distancing, etc., we'd get on top of this. But unfortunately, there will be segments of the population that just won't play along with that. And we've really seen that play out in the United States. It's incredible to see a dramatic escalation of the virus, particularly in states that a couple of months ago were out protesting about the loss of liberty, and they were forcing their governors to reopen their states. So, we've got to behave in a responsible way, because it's a massive threat
But look,
and will remain a massive threat.
you see, Jim, that what's something that I guess many other people might not realize, which is that in Ireland, we are a very small economy relative to the rest of the world. So if we have the situation in states like the US where people just won't comply with the guidelines, won't comply with the regulations, and the US economy takes a huge hit, wouldn't that have a knock-on effect for the rest of the world? And if that were the case, could we be heading into a global recession?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. The global economy is on a knife edge at the moment. And if over the coming months we were to see a serious escalation of the infection rate and the death rate, and we're starting to see it in the United States, large swathes of California, for example, are being shut back down again.
Mm-hmm.
The consequences of that from an economic perspective are devastating. And if you think about, for example, Ireland's status, where US multinationals play such an important part in our economic model,
Mm-hmm.
The Industrial Development Authority here recognizes that there's going to be a dramatic decline in inward investment this year because, US companies just won't be in the business of expansion, traveling overseas, etc. So, yeah, I mean, the States is still the world's biggest economy. And if the States implodes again economically, the reverberations for the rest of the world will be absolutely dramatic. And it'd be one thing, if you could sort of lock down an economy. You look at New Zealand, for example, a couple of weeks back, it reached the status of having no coronavirus in the country.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, I would not define that as success, because the big challenge now for New Zealand would be, as a country that is very heavily dependent on tourism, how are they going to open up their borders to foreign travel again safely?
Mm-hmm.
There are no easy answers here. It's easy to say, shut down your border, let nobody in and out of your country. That's very, very difficult to do. And for a small open economy like Ireland, it's a big challenge. But it does worry me, to see plane loads of Americans coming into the country. It worries me that people are coming in from the UK through Northern Ireland and can come down here freely.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be very hard for us to control all of that.
But as somebody who's been around the block for several years, you've been an economist, you've been an accountant, you understand this a hell of a lot better than I do, or than most people do, from a practical perspective, what it's like in the real world, So just honestly, is it practical, or is it realistic for international commerce, trade, business to occur via Zoom meetings instead of via international travel and physical meetings?
No, it's not indefinitely. It is a short-term solution, but it is not a long-term solution, because at the end of the day, international commerce happens through physical meetings. I mean, the personal thing is still an incredibly important part of business. So I don't think this is the future, but I do think that it does provide an alternative. Maybe where we might have traveled on business to the United States 7 or 8 times a year. Maybe you can do that once a year now. So it can certainly cut down on international travel. And from an environmental perspective, that obviously would be very, very beneficial. But I still think at the end of the day, when we return to some semblance of normality, business will return to this notion of face-to-face meetings and so on.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So, tying into that then, even though we are quite a small country, we've been extremely successful in the field of international aviation. The fact that Ryanair have dominated the low fares market across the European Union for decades now, and Aer Lingus, which is part of IAG International Airlines Group in London, who own Spanish Airlines, British Airways, the lot. We have a very close connection to the aviation industry as a country. So, given that we're in these very uncertain times, do you think that it could be necessary for the government to step in and provide some sort of financial supports for these companies, or would that be questionable from a European competition perspective?
Okay, there's a couple of interesting points there. One is about Ireland's position in the global aviation industry. You know, obviously Ryanair has been an incredible success story over recent years, and it just shows that when a disruptor comes into an industry and does it well and does it economically, the impact can be very, very significant and very, very positive. The Ireland's status as basically the global hub of aircraft leasing now, you know, that is a direct result of GPA back in the 1980s, Guinness Peat Aviation, which ultimately went out of business. But before it went out of business, it spawned all of these aircraft leasing experts who went on to form a number of other businesses. So it has spawned into something that has put Ireland on the global map. So that's really positive. But in terms of the whole Ryanair situation, Michael O'Leary and Eddie Wilson, the CEO of Ryanair, you know, have been quite vocal in recent times about the state support that's being given to airlines that it competes with in Europe, such as Lufthansa, Air France, and that is unfair competition. There's no doubt about it. And the EU has stood back. It has relaxed its state aid rules, okay? So it has created a situation where Ireland's biggest airline, Ryanair, is now competing on a totally unfair basis with some of its European competitors. So I think that has to be rectified. I mean, I believe that any subsidization of those airlines, it should apply quid pro quo for Ryanair. And I think if it doesn't, it is just going to seriously distort competition. So I can totally empathize with the executives in Ryanair who are feeling very, very aggrieved, or at least that's the impression one gets at the moment about the subsidization of its competitors. So it's one thing for the European Union to discard state aid rules during a crisis like this, which is good, but the aid needs to be spread proportionately and fairly, and it's not happening at the moment.
So bringing it back then to the micro level, something you picked up on earlier, which is quite interesting, is about kind of taking personal responsibility in these unprecedented times. So for somebody who's out there maybe graduating at the moment or had a job before lockdown and doesn't really know what their employment status is going to be like, what kind of steps could a person take in these times to really own that responsibility? For example, would you recommend that given that people are out of work, or given that people are going to be looking for jobs in a highly competitive job market, that people seek alternative means of making income, whether it's through some sort of online businesses or whether it's through investments, stock exchanges, index funds, or is that very risky business?
Well, I actually think there's a segment of our graduates population that I'd be very positive about. You know, those coming out with good skills like data science, you know, IT skills, many skills like that, they will do well in the Ireland of the future. The people you worry about are those who have relatively low levels of educational attainment, who work in industries that are really exposed at the moment to the pandemic. They're in many cases low paid in any event. Those are the segment of the population that we really need to focus in on, hone in on, to make sure they have as good a chance as possible to survive in this new world. So at the individual level, you know, I definitely think we should all be doing it. It's not just young people. We should all be trying to upskill ourselves at the moment, try and learn the skills that will be necessary to succeed in the new world. So you need to take a strategic view on this. You know, what are the skills that will be required in the future? What can I do to attain some of those skills? And for example, you know, there are thousands of courses online, either very cheap or free, that people who have nothing better to be doing at the moment should be looking at. So we need education does not end when you leave school or college. Education should be a lifetime pursuit. And those that will do best and succeed best in life will be those that continue to reinvent themselves, continue to garner new skills, and so on. So, I was talking to somebody this morning, actually, who had a pretty successful business mentoring people in a certain niche industry. Okay, if I say the niche industry, I'll identify the
You'll
person.
be giving them away, yeah, of course.
I don't want to do that, but it's a pretty niche industry. And he was sort of saying in the last 6 months, that business has effectively died because mentoring is not something people are particularly interested in at the moment. Too many other concerns. So he is now doing, this is kind of bizarre, but he is doing personal training classes for local women every morning, for example. Mm-hmm. He has reinvented himself very quickly, and he did a course in it, so he can do it in a qualified way. So people are doing all sorts of things at the moment to reinvent. If you look, for example, and this is the beauty of an entrepreneur, if you look at the restaurants, the pubs, what they've done, the coffee shops over the last 3 or 4 months, they've had to dramatically change their business model, online, click and collect, takeaway, all of this stuff. And in fact, those that have reopened, I speak to a lot of them on an ongoing basis, their capacity is down 50% because of social distancing requirements within a restaurant. But their business volumes are actually probably ahead even of this time last year, because they're getting in so much business from alternative stuff like delivery. Mm-hmm. So that is why I think the most important thing a graduate can have is just an entrepreneurial spirit. Recognize the challenges you're facing into, recognize the opportunities that are out there, and recognize what I need to do to exploit those opportunities. It all sounds like sort of motherhood and pie, whatever that saying is. But at a time like this, you just see people doing it out there at the moment. And I think that's really, really important, and it's refreshing. And it's why I would be an eternal optimist. Regardless of the nature, if one has a personal crisis, that's different. But regardless of the nature of the economic challenges out there, human nature is get up and go, get out and do something about it, make it happen. And the way in which the Irish economy reinvented itself from 2011 onwards, just shows that there is a very strong entrepreneurial culture in this country. There's a lot of people out there, who basically make things happen for themselves and for others. That's really important. And we should never, ever discourage that sort of behavior through the tax system or anything else.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you something. It might seem a little bit cutthroat, but I think it might be a fair assessment too. Is it true that in times like this, that those companies that go out of business, who haven't been able to innovate and make the changes that were required to survive, that's just natural, that it's going to happen, that from a productivity perspective and from a development in the national economy perspective, that some companies just are not meant to keep up with the times?
Yeah, that's Schumpeter's creative destruction, I think you've just described. Over time, certain businesses disappear, and then you get new businesses coming in, reinventing themselves, taking over the mantle. And that really happened after 2008, 2009. Many businesses quite simply went out of business for a variety of reasons, but mainly the economic environment. But then new businesses came in. They didn't have the debt legacy of the businesses that went out of business, so they were starting sort of with a blank sheet of paper. And we saw a massive reinvigoration of the economy. If you look at, the number of coffee shops, restaurants, and so on that opened up after 2011, 2012, and we more than replaced those that went during the crisis. This time round, I wouldn't be that cutthroat about it, because I think this is so different. Because what happened, many businesses in early March had absolutely nothing to do with anything they did themselves or didn't do. they were quite simply forced to shut down.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's why I have argued from the beginning of the crisis that it is essential that policymakers and governments step in and support those businesses that were forced to shut down. Okay, there's a couple of things needed here. One is support those businesses while they were shut down in order to ensure they will be able to reopen and re-employ people as quickly as possible. The second part of it is after they reopen, obviously this is heavily dependent on how the virus evolves globally and domestically. But for the next 12, 18 months, you would think that the business environment is going to be challenging for many businesses. So they will require TLC for a prolonged period of time. And I think that's essential. Okay, people will argue, well, if you do that, if you step in with a blanket approach, you are actually going to end up giving money to businesses that were unviable in the first place. And there's not a lot you can do about that other than go back and look at their accounts when they shut down to see where they're viable or not. And practically, I don't think that's possible. So mistakes will be made, but so be it. If you're in a crisis situation like this, you've got to be brave. And when you're brave, you make mistakes. I never, ever, ever criticize anybody. And God knows I've done it myself over the years, but I am loath to criticize anybody for making a mistake. Because if you do nothing in life, you will make no mistakes. If you do stuff in life, you will make mistakes inevitably. That's human nature. So I think we've got to go for it. But there's also, I think there should be fundamental learning lessons to be learned from this. If you are in a customer-facing business, for example, having a strong online presence is essential. And those businesses that don't have that have been and are and will be in serious trouble. So businesses, they've got to reinvent themselves. They've got to do what they need to do. And it's only in a situation of crisis you realize what works and what doesn't work. So, let's get on with it. But I say my imperative would be to make sure that as many of those businesses possible that were shut down in early March, number one, are able to reopen, and number two, and more importantly, are able to survive the next couple of years, because it is only through those businesses, or indeed new business coming back on stream, that people will be re-employed, and that hopefully we will get back to the problem we were facing in February of this year in this country, which was the problem of full employment and labour shortages, etc. The aim should be to get back to that situation again, but it is going to take a while. But it is possible. It certainly is possible. We dug ourselves out of a much, much deeper hole, in my view, back from 2011 onwards, and we'll do it again.
So you mentioned the steps that should be taken to assist businesses, and with those businesses that closed, several people were out of work. I'm not sure what was the percentage of people that were out of work at its peak during the pandemic. Do you know?
Well, the unemployment rate went to just over 28% of the labour force, and
28%.
28% in April and May. It's now back at 26%, but in February it was at 4.8%. We were virtually at full employment. So it just there's another lesson here, I think, and the lesson is that economists are constantly criticised over their inability to forecast the future. And I think when I spoke to your class back in Tramore those years ago, I would have said that economics is not a physical science. Economics is a social science. Economic outcomes are driven by human behaviour, and human behaviour is rarely forecastable. And the second piece is that there is always stuff out there waiting to hit you, knock you off course. Who would have predicted 6 months ago that COVID-19 would have the impact that it has had on the global economy? So there's always stuff out there waiting to happen. But I suppose what businesses and individuals always need to plan for is the unplanned. The only certainty in life is uncertainty. So you need to make sure that you can create as sustainable a business as possible that is capable of tolerating shocks. I'm not saying that what has happened in the last 3 or 4 months is really exceptional stuff. You'd hope it's a sort of a black swan event. But businesses generally, they need to plan. And it shows at an individual level and at a business level, planning is absolutely essential.
Now, one of those steps that was taken to assist that 26-28% that were unemployed was this COVID unemployment payment.
Yes.
I think it's, I don't know, maybe you disagree with me. I think it's probably the closest thing that we've ever seen in Ireland to a universal basic income, given how many people were out of work and given that it was this uniform payment to everybody who fit the criteria of being out of work due to COVID.
Yes, I mean, the fact that we had over 1.2 million people on various types of unemployment assistance, roughly almost 1 million of those directly related to COVID-19. That is a situation without precedent. And, the government responded, and I think it responded correctly by saying what we really need to do here is make sure that people can survive this crisis. And they pump money in. I think it was the correct response. Obviously, it's incredibly expensive. Obviously, it cannot last forever. So, what we will see over the coming months, probably through to next spring, is a gradual tapering off of that sort of financial support as people's personal circumstances start to improve again, as they are re-employed and so on. But yeah, I mean, you're correct. Never before did we see such an aggressive approach by government to make sure that family incomes were maintained. And I suppose that's what a universal basic income is. But, there's a growing body of research showing that if you ensure families a certain level of income, a minimum level of income, that the economic and the social outcome from that is very, very positive.
So you would be quite supportive of the UBI proposal?
I would indeed, absolutely. If we had this discussion 3 or 4 years ago, I mightn't have been quite as convinced. But I suppose my view in life is when the facts change, I change my mind. And I think we've seen increasingly, and I suppose with Brexit and Trump, it really brings it home to me, just how dangerous inequality is, and that we have got to address it. And universal basic income, depending on the level you set it, obviously will be very, very expensive, full stop. But actually, if you look at it on a cost benefit basis, you look at the benefits that will flow from that, I think ultimately it would far outweigh the costs involved. I'm still developing my thinking in this area. I'm working on a paper at the moment about what a universal basic income could look like. But I think it's certainly something we should at least consider very strongly at the moment.
And it's in the programme for government that the Low Pay Commission are to look at this issue, and perhaps that the government would run a trial programme for UBI.
Yes, absolutely. And funny enough, most people, I think, don't realize that the United States came very, very close to a universal basic income once. Okay, Lyndon Johnson was trying to push that agenda, and the mantle then, surprise, surprise, was taken up by the arch Republican Nixon, and Nixon nearly got a universal basic income over the line, but it was defeated by Congress. And the main reason it was defeated was because there was a view that, if you give people an income every year, it will remove the incentive for people to work. So they then turned around, and instead of the universal basic income, which was almost over the line, they introduced sort of a personal tax credit system, so that if you were working, you were supported, but if you weren't working, you got less support. So it was trying to create an incentive for people to work. And I actually think it's a pity that Nixon didn't succeed with that, because if he had succeeded, I think the United States could be a very, very different country today. So it just shows you that if you get brave political decisions, the long-term ramifications can be incredibly positive, or vice versa.
Now,
So,
I myself, I support the universal basic income too, actually. We had never discussed this before, actually, but I support it too, and I've written a paper about how it's compatible with labor rights and how it's compatible with human rights, and that it should be something that's promoted on by the international community. But a couple of questions that I have for you from researching that would be, firstly, do you think that if we were to implement a UBI in Ireland, that it should really be a universal basic income, or should it be tied to the conditions in which people live? So, for example, somebody living in rural Leitrim might have a lower UBI than somebody living in central Dublin.
No, I think when you start going down to that sort of discriminatory approach to it, it's not going to work. It is going to create it's going to create a negative reaction. So I think if you're going to introduce it, you introduce it for everybody.
Agreed.
Full stop. Absolutely.
And then secondly, there's been a different approach that has been taken in states like Finland, which had its own trial program. And even in Alaska, they've had one for decades, which has been tied to paying people a dividend from oil. So what are the questions in the, I guess you could say, UBI community, is whether UBI should supplement or replace existing social payments and social programs. What do you think about that?
I think it should replace.
Okay.
Rather than supplement, absolutely.
So for somebody who's watching the program who is maybe not as familiar with the topic as you and I, would you say then, what would the practical implications of that be? Would the implications be that there is no unemployment benefit, no parental payments or pension payments? What would it mean from a practical perspective for somebody sitting at home?
Well, that's what it could mean, is that there is one simple form of social welfare that's paid to everybody over the age of 18 or whatever age you decide, okay? Everybody gets a minimum income of 25, 30,000, whatever level you decide you can afford, okay? And then all other benefits virtually removed. Okay, you can have nuances that can be a little bit nuanced. You can, child benefit perhaps could still be paid in addition to that. So there are many variations on this. The bog standard universal basic income model would be you pay everybody over a certain age a basic level of income, and that's it. That is the sum total of what government will spend on in terms of social protection for people. But obviously for that to work, it needs to be set at a certain level. And okay, you could say then people who are earning 100 grand a year are going to get a universal basic income. Well, if they do, it becomes part of their taxable income. Whereas if my universal basic income is my only income, I pay none or very little tax. But the more I earn, the more tax. I think it's consistent with a progressive tax system, to be honest.
Yeah.
But Colin, I have to say my thinking on this is not very well developed at the moment.
You're new to the topic in that way, I guess, yeah?
Well, I am, absolutely. And what has really got me thinking about it was Brexit and Trump had me thinking about it. But in the last 6 months with COVID-19 and looking at the implications of COVID-19 for inequality around the world, that has got me thinking a lot more seriously about it. And we've seen a few really interesting books being written over the last couple of years that have also made me very curious about this. The Financial Times columnist Martin Sandbu, I've probably pronounced his name wrong, but he has just published a book called The Economics of Belonging. There's a Dutch historian a couple of years ago that wrote a book, the exact title, Utopia for All, which explores the same sort of stuff. So there's more and more people starting to think about this now because they recognize that the way we're going is not working, and it is going to lead us to hell if we continue to move in this direction. And the road to hell is paved with stuff like Brexit and Trump, in my view.
And
so
For someone that's listening to you saying that about the road to hell, what would you say to someone who says that, Jim, Colm, your idea is great and all, but it's going to push up inflation?
Well, I can't see how it's going to push up inflation, okay? Because, at the end of the day, well, in the current environment anyway, the lack of inflation, and this has been the case for a decade now, the lack of inflation is the big world structural problem. So a bit of inflation would actually be very desirable at the moment. But longer term, pumping that sort of money into an economy could cause inflation. Well, if it does, you respond to inflation as you normally respond to inflation. You tighten fiscal policy, you increase taxes, for example, or you increase interest rates. You use monetary policy. There are ways of tackling inflation when it becomes a problem. But I think to simply stand back and say a UBI would just result in inflation, I think is a very, very lazy intellectual approach to the issue. I mean, at the end of the day, if you can create a basic quality of life for as many people as possible in society, we will all benefit from that. Because at the end of the day, if I was getting universal basic income of 30 grand and it was my only income, I'm going to go out and I'm going to spend all of that.
It goes back into the economy.
It goes back into the economy, absolutely. And the reality is that a euro you give to somebody earning 20,000 has much more economic impact than a euro you give to somebody who's on 100,000, because the low income person getting the extra euro is very likely to spend that euro in their local economy. Whereas for the higher income people, they'll go on a foreign holiday or they'll buy a new car or whatever. So some of it will leak out of the system. So no, I don't buy the argument about this being a generator of inflation, and because there are ways of dealing with inflation.
Now, my last question for you, Jim, it's one that has split opinion. I have mixed feelings about it myself. Is this a ruling by the General Court of the European Union in favour of Apple and Ireland? The appeal case which went forward on, I think it was last week, right?
Yeah.
So the court ruled that Ireland wasn't in breach, and that the 13 billion euro ruling that the European Commission found from 2016 did not have to be paid, that it was a lawful payment. That it was lawful, the tax system was lawful at the time. So from your perspective, Jim, do you think that this is a lost opportunity for the taxpayer to recoup 13 billion euros, or is it beneficial for our economy from an FDI perspective?
Well, I think that the ruling has been misinterpreted. People were saying this is a vindication of Ireland's corporate tax system. It's not actually. The European Commission, as I understand it, and I'm not a legal expert, but it strikes me from what I read that the European Commission actually made a total bags of the case, and that they went about it totally wrong way. It's a little bit like UEFA's approach to Manchester City, another controversial ruling over the last couple of weeks.
Ruling, yeah.
Absolutely. So I don't think we should see this as a victory for Ireland or for Ireland's corporate tax system. I mean, I think there is a fundamental. Okay, going back to the 13 billion specifically, it was never the case that 13 billion was going to go back to the Irish government anyway, because many governments around Europe would have wanted a slice of that justifiably. Okay, but I think there is a growing fundamental issue now about corporation tax and the amount of tax these corporations pay, because we talk about universal basic income. I just believe that the corporate world has got to stand up and play its part here as well, because at the end of the day, for corporations, operating in a stable political climate is incredibly important, because the growth of radical politics is not good for multinationals or for corporations. It shouldn't be. So I think there should be a vested interest here for corporations to step up to the plate and pay their fair share of tax. And I would be, and this is controversial in an Irish context, I would be a total fan of some of the international corporate tax developments at the moment, like the Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base, the CCCTB that's been pushed by the European Union, the BEPS project, the Base Erosion Profit Shifting project that's been pushed by the OECD. I mean, what's happening here is that countries are justifiably, and forgive my technical expression, they're justifiably pissed off at the moment at the notion that other countries are basically using their tax system to steal tax revenues away from them. So I can see where the controversy about Ireland's corporate tax system, the Dutch corporate tax system, Luxembourg, where that's all coming from. And if you superimpose this on the context of global demographic developments, what we're seeing in countries like France, Germany, is a rapid aging of their populations. The implications of that for health expenditure, for pension expenditure is dramatic. So countries like that are facing massive pressure to increase spending. And how do you fund spending? Through taxation. And if you have countries like Ireland that are deemed to be using their tax system to take what's rightfully ours, you are going to get very upset about that. So the bottom line is that regardless of the Apple ruling last week, Ireland's corporate tax system is going to become increasingly pressurized. And I hope it does, because I think morality and fair play and justice should be a global issue here, okay? But what we then need to do is to make sure that Ireland competes for foreign direct investment based on our other attributes, other than taxation. Okay, I don't have a problem with 12.5% corporation tax rate, but I do believe that the effective tax rate should be 12.5%, okay? But we need to compete on the basis of other things we offer. We're the only English-speaking country in the European Union, with the modest exception of Malta. We have a young, well-educated labour force. And what I really think we should be focusing in on as well at the moment is investment in education, particularly third-level education, to make sure, you know, we're at the cutting edge of continuing to produce graduates. Because at the end of the day, the most important thing for a company in making decisions to locate is the availability of a labour force. So we really do need to broaden the debate here away from taxation into the other areas where we compete for foreign direct investment. And I hate using a term that was coined, I think, by the second last Prime Minister at this stage, or Taoiseach at this stage, but make Ireland, you know, the best small country in the world in which to do business. But that should not be based on allowing companies pay virtually no tax here.
Sure. So let me ask you a final question. It's an easy one. You've given superb answers to these challenging issues that many people are facing, many businesses are facing, or many people would look at from a macro perspective. So I'll throw an easier question at you. For any business or anybody who's looking to get in touch with you for economic advice, guidance, analysis, what would be the best way for them to do it?
Jim at jimpowereconomics.ie.
Best way for them to get in touch?
Yeah, you can go on my website, Jim Power Economics. You can find contact details there. Always delighted to help out particularly small businesses, because I just think that we pay so much attention to the large corporations that we ignore businesses that account for 99.8% of our total businesses in the country, the SME sector. And I suppose the areas that really interest me these days are SMEs and rural and regional economic development, and quality of life. Actually, is those three areas really interest me at this juncture. I spent 20 years of my life working in financial services. I got out of it. I'm glad, and reinvented myself. I'm glad I did, because there's a much more interesting world out there. I'm not saying, you know, financial services is interesting for a while, but the danger is you get caught in it forever and you know nothing else. You know, there's a bigger, broader world out there.
Well, Jim, thank you for coming on the program. It's been great having you, and I think we'll probably be seeing you again. We might need you for further advice in the future, because economics is an evolving thing.
It is indeed, Colin. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity.